Good afternoon, good evening. It's great to have you here. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Welcome to our second program this week. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which aside from me, includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Special welcome and thanks to our guest tonight, Noah Feldman, and to our wonderful interlocutor, Larry Mantle. We are eager to hear what Noah will speak about, and we know it's going to be related to his recently released book, To Be a Jew Today, which is excellent, highly recommended. Very interesting post-October 7th analysis. It's a new guide to God, Israel, and the Jewish people. Today is Juneteenth, National Independence Day, which commemorates the official ending of slavery in the United States. It was on June 19th, 1865, when there was an order issued by Major General Granger calling for the final enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation, which had, of course, been issued by President Lincoln 2.5 years before. June 19th, 1865 was shortly after the Civil War effectively ended when Robert E. Lee surrendered his troops to General Grant, but the Civil War was not officially over until more than a year later in August 1866, when then President Johnson issued a proclamation announcing the end of the American Civil War. The proclamation included these words: "And I do further proclaim that the said insurrection," referring to the Civil War, "is at an end, and that peace, order, tranquility, and civil authority now exists in and throughout the whole of the United States." Today, we must continue to confront systemic racism and injustice in all of its forms. I know that it reminds us, Juneteenth reminds us of our obligation to be vigilant about systemic racism and injustice and continue to work towards a more equitable, just, and inclusive society. We can also hope that the deep divisions which are so evident in our country today, divisions which have inspired this America at a Crossroads series, divisions which span the racial, economic, social, and political spheres, will, with our vigilance, engagement, and activism, abate. We know that declarations and proclamations are wholly inadequate to bring about systemic change, and that nothing replaces the hard work required to bring about a more just society, just as it is hard work that will protect and preserve our democracy. Next Wednesday, June 26th, we welcome a face familiar to anyone who watches MSNBC, a man with a long and distinguished Department of Justice career, now a professor at NYU Law School and a legal analyst for MSNBC, Andrew Weissman. There are few lawyers in the country with greater understanding of our criminal justice system and with the ins and outs of all of the various Trump criminal cases. He will be in conversation with Pat Morrison on the topic, the quest for accountability and experts' analysis of Trump's liabilities. Be sure to continue to save Wednesdays, every Wednesday from 5 to 6 Pacific for the indefinite future. We have every intention to bring you the highest quality programming each week with the best possible guests on the most relevant and pressing topics of the day. Remember that every single one of our programs is recorded and is available by podcast the morning after, and also to view on our YouTube channel and on our website. The links are in all of our emails. Feel very free to share those links with your friends. Believe it or not, we get as many people watching after the fact, thousands in fact, as we do watching during each of our programs. Now to introduce our speaker, please welcome my friend and my colleague, former Los Angeles City Council member and longtime Los Angeles County Supervisor, Zev Yaroslavsky, to introduce our speaker tonight. Zev?
Thank you very much, Janice. And it's a privilege to introduce our speaker and moderator for this evening's program. Noah Feldman is an American legal scholar and academic. He is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and chairman of the Harvard Society of Fellows. Noah's work is focused on ethics and constitutional law with an emphasis on innovation, free speech, law, and religion, as well as history. One of his constitutional law students at NYU Law School was none other than my own son. And by the way, another of his students was Mel Levine, our colleague, his son at Harvard Law School, both in constitutional law. So it's a family affair. Noah is the author of 10 nonfiction books on a wide variety of subjects, including his most recent book published after the October 7th attack by Hamas, entitled To Be a Jew Today, A New Guide to God, Israel, and the Jewish People. His other books include The Broken Constitution, Divided by God, What We Owe Iraq, Cool War, Scorpions, The Three Lives of James Madison, and The Arab Winter. Since 2012, he has been a regular columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. He is also regularly a contributor to the New York Review of Books about constitutional topics and the Supreme Court. Since 2019, Professor Feldman has been the host of the podcast Deep Background, which focuses on the historical, scientific, legal, and cultural context underlying the news, with the focus on power and ethics. Noah Feldman is fluent in English, Hebrew, Arabic, and French. He also speaks conversational Korean and reads Greek, Latin, German, Italian, Spanish, and Aramaic. So if you haven't been impressed or intimidated by now, I give up. Our moderator this evening is one of America's and Southern California's most respected broadcast journalism, Larry Mantle. Larry is now in his 40th year as host of public radio's Air Talk on radio station LAist, formerly known as KPCC. His expertise includes politics, arts and culture, business, foreign affairs, and just about everything from A to Z. He is a moderator's moderator who has received virtually every broadcast journalism award there is, and we are fortunate and grateful to have him as one of our regular interlocutors on America at a Crossroads. So Larry, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Zev. I appreciate your kind words so much. It means a lot to me, and I appreciate our friendship over all these years. Thank you, Janice and Mel. It's wonderful to be a part of the America at a Crossroads family with the extraordinary guests that come to these programs each week, sometimes like this one, even twice a week. It's so good to be with you. Particularly, I'm glad to be leading this conversation with Professor Feldman as I'm still processing his book and thinking about all the things that it raises about being a Jewish American. And to the point, it was difficult to prepare my outline of questions because there's so many fascinating areas that he raises in this book. And though I'm not Jewish, since childhood, I've been interested in learning about the diversity of thought and cultures within Jewish America, and in what ways they do or don't correspond to theological traditions within Judaism. And that is a significant theme of Professor Feldman's book, and one of the reasons I found it particularly fascinating. Thank you so much. It's great to have you with us. Thank you, Noah. Let's start first, before we focus on Israel and divisions within American Jewish politics. I'd like to start with the 4 Jewish belief patterns that you identify in the book, which don't neatly correspond to the familiar terms of Orthodox, Reform, and Conservative Judaism. Your 4 belief patterns are the traditional, the progressive, the evolutionist, and the godless. Please elaborate on what each of those 4 beliefs bring to Judaism and how that factors into other views like relationship with Israel.
Thank you so much for having me, Larry. Thank you for being interlocutor, and thanks to the whole team for hosting me. You know, the overall argument of the book is that if you want to understand the Jews, either from the inside or the outside, you have to begin by realizing that the Jews are a large, loving, and somewhat dysfunctional family. And in the book, I try to figure out answers to the question, why be a Jew? I call the book To Be a Jew because you don't have to be. You know, there might have been a time in my great-grandparents, let's say, where no one gave you a choice. If you were born a Jew, you would be treated as a Jew, full stop. But that's not true for my kids. They could choose something different. And so I wanted to come up with categories to describe Jews that have something to do not just with where they belong, but with what they actually believe. Because I'm interested in the question of why. You know, why should you do something like being a Jew in whatever way you choose? So the first group, the traditionalists, are people who believe that God gave the Torah to the Jews on Mount Sinai, and that as part of that process, he told them who was going to be in charge. You know, the prophets would be in charge until there were no more prophets, and then the rabbis would be in charge, and they would interpret his law, and that law would be law, and it would be binding. And if you're a traditionalist, you're fine with all of that. You're not troubled by it. It doesn't wake you up necessarily at 3 in the morning. I mean, it could, but to be a real traditionalist, you have to go back to sleep and say, no, all's right with the world. I am doing the authentic thing that God wants me to do. And I know I'm doing that because I'm listening to the rabbis today and following God's law. Progressive Jews take a different perspective. Progressive Jews say, sure, we believe in God in whatever form we choose to believe in God. And we also believe that God has a core moral teaching for the Jewish people and indeed the whole world. And that moral teaching is justice, justice shalt thou pursue. You know, without a view like that, you couldn't have an organization called Jews United for Democracy and Justice, right? Without that progressive idea, you couldn't even imagine such an organization. It would be like Jews United for Bowling. There would be no connection between the Jews and the bowling. But Jews United for Democracy and Justice implies a real connection between being a Jew and justice and democracy. And to have that point of view, you have to accept that as our morals change over time as human beings, as we discover new moral truths, we become more inclusive. We adopt gay rights, we move beyond racism, that what we're doing is working out as human beings the best we can what God, however we understand God, really intended for us to do the whole time. And that's progressive Judaism. And so if the law, as it's on the books, contradicts what we believe today, we're okay with gently and respectfully putting the law aside. So it doesn't matter if there have been no gay marriages for 2,000 years of Jewish history. Now there are, and there should be, because we now understand better the genuine importance of equality and the possibilities of constructing family for everybody, regardless of sexual orientation.
Or women rabbis would be another example.
Women rabbis is a great example. And in fact, it's a great example, Larry, because it shows you starkly the difference between progressives and traditionalists. Because to the traditionalists, there's really no compromise on the woman rabbi thing, because the rabbis ascertained that women wouldn't be rabbis. And even if our morals have changed, we're stuck with what the rabbis authoritatively said. And since the traditionalist rabbis won't let any women become rabbis, big shock, they're not changing their view on that subject. But if you're a progressive Jew, no difficulty at all in saying, now that we understand the equality of the sexes better, of course women should be rabbis. It's an obvious no-brainer. Evolutionists are the people who are trying to do something in the middle. And I was raised as some kind of an evolutionist in this sense. So I love it and respect it, but it's also not how I've always chosen to live my life. And the evolutionists say, we accept that God gave the Torah at Mount Sinai, and we accept that the law is binding. But we know that human beings have to do the job of interpretation. And because we're humans and we have to do the interpretation, we can try to interpret the law consistent with our moral values today. And that means a struggle, because sometimes you can interpret the Bible allegorically. You know, you can say, well, the Bible says the earth was created in 6 days. That doesn't literally mean days. It means eons or eras, or it's a metaphor. But it's a lot harder when you get into a law that tells you specifically don't eat pork. And you think, well, maybe there was no good reason for that today, but the rule is still on the books. And so women rabbis are a good example there too, Larry, because the evolutionists are really up a tree about women rabbis. Some of them say, absolutely, we can't do this. Others say, yes, we can. We have to do it gradually. And there's actually a real division within evolutionist Judaism about this. And the last category, the godless, includes anybody who says, I definitely don't believe in God, or I almost never believe in God, and I am a proud Jew, and I identify my Jewishness perhaps in many cases with Israel, because nationalism is a very powerful form of identity for a group of people, and Jews are a people, and they have a nationalism associated with Israel, and that could be your Jewishness. You could be a lox and bagel Jew, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I have a whole section of the book called In Defense of Lox and Bagel Jews. That means that you care about the culture, and you care about the group. And actually, a friend of mine, Michael Alexander, who's a professor of religion at UC Riverside, gave me a wonderful example. He said, I'm a fan. I'm a Jew fan. I root for the Jews. And it's like rooting for a team. And I love my team. And I'm from Boston, so we understand really loving your team. But he said, you know, at the same time, I taught my kids to love the team, but if they don't choose that, I'm okay with that. It's not the end of the world. And I think that's also a perfectly legitimate and appropriate way to be Jewish. And it's important for me to conclude by saying, I don't in the book tell you one of these is right and the others are wrong. Not at all. I have held all of these views at different times in my life, and I believe that all of them are valid and legitimate ways of going about being Jewish.
One of the many things I learned in your book, in fact, is that for traditionalists, they saw Zionism as heresy. And I never realized that. And wow, have things turned on their head?
They really have evolved, let's say. The ultra-Orthodox traditionalists completely rejected Zionism, as you say, as a heresy, because early Zionists said, we're not waiting around for God to send us the Messiah and redeem us. we're going to replace God with a secular nationalism, and then we won't need religion at all. You know, the early Zionists in Israel were ready for religion to die off entirely. They expected that to happen. And so the early Zionists were rejected completely by the great majority of traditionalist Jews. A tiny number of evolutionists embraced it, embraced Zionism, and they evolved eventually into the movement now known as religious Zionism, which has turned out to be one of the most creative, innovative, and in some ways inspiring, and in other ways very terrifying at its extremes, positions within contemporary Israel. And the traditionalists have done something even more interesting. They still don't call themselves Zionists, but they're fully enmeshed in the life of Israel. They often identify with the objectives of the state. And what they will say is, well, we don't serve in the military, but by studying Torah, we're serving the interests of the state because we're really protecting the state through our study of Torah, which is a really interesting compromise. It's very different from the old approach they had where they rejected the state altogether. Because if you're saying, I'm studying to serve the state, then you're saying the state is legitimate and worthwhile.
How does the notion of Zionism today get reconciled in Judaism? Is it possible to reconcile it when you used to have, it seems to me, and I think you say this in the book, that among progressives, historically, there was a strong belief in Zionism. But now we see that fracturing, particularly along generational lines. So with Zionism, the whole concept of it becoming this lightning rod, how do American Jews work through this division?
So let me start my answer, Larry, by saying that what I'm about to say is going to be very live and personal for a lot of our listeners. And so I want to speak with humility, but also from my own personal experience. For most liberal, progressive American Jews, say my age and older, you know, I'm square in the middle of Gen X. There was a pretty straightforward way to reconcile Zionism with progressive, liberal, and both small d democratic and sometimes large d democratic values. And it was this: Israel is a democracy. And it says in its Declaration of Independence that the state must be Jewish and democratic, and that all people who live in Israel, including people who are not Jews, are entitled to equal rights. And that point of view was, in my view, and can remain, fully logically compatible with Israel being a Jewish state, again, provided that its non-Jewish citizens are treated equally. So since progressive American Jews, like a lot of Jews around the world, have long believed that Israel contributes to the safety of Jews around the world, some believe that it offers the opportunity, or that it did offer the opportunity for Jews to actually be a light unto the nations by doing a really good job of being democratic, of taking the biblical message of loving the stranger, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt, and putting it into action. As long as that's your vision of Israel, there's really no difficulty at all reconciling Zionism with being a progressive Jew, none. And the problem arises if you start to believe, as some millennials, especially younger millennials, and a significant number of Gen Z American Jews have come to do, or have begun to do, that the way Israel is configured today isn't compatible with the values of liberal democracy. And, you know, that isn't always based on deep knowledge, but sometimes it is based on deeper knowledge. And of course, it's not true by any means of all young Jews, but there are Jews for whom that is definitely the case. And I remember bringing my kids to Israel, each for the first time when they were 11 or 12. And I remember very vividly, we spent most of the time in Israel, and then I took my son to Bethlehem. So we crossed into the West Bank and, you know, went underneath the barrier, the wall. And, you know, when he was pretty quiet and looking at everything. And when he came back, he said to me, Dad, I understand all the history that you've taught me, and I understand about the Intifada and the second Intifada and the bombs. I know why the wall is there. But just look at the disparity of how people are living on the two sides of the wall. Everyone's living so well on the Israeli side, and they're living so terribly on the Palestinian side. And, you know, to me, this was a good piece of input of how things look from the perspective of a kid who then grew up to be he's now going off to college. And for him, and a lot of people in his generation, they don't know the history. My son literally does know the history of the Holocaust. I raised him that way. He knows the history of Israel very, very well, but those weren't live experiences for him. And what he sees is inequality. So if that's your view, you, and you believe that your religion is committed to liberal democratic values, then there's a real tension, or there can be a real tension between your Jewishness and a commitment to Israel as it actually exists today.
And we should just mention, by the way, I know that your kids were really in mind as you wrote this book to try to get into these issues with, as them coming into full adulthood, things that they would be thinking about. But I mean, I think it's hard for many of us to think, well, if you don't have Zionism, or if Israel doesn't exist, despite its faults, despite all the righteous criticism of how the Israeli government is conducting the war and dealing with other issues within the country, if you don't have Israel, you don't have Zionism, well, then how does that affect American Jewish life? I mean, if you didn't have that as a central issue.
You know, at present, American Jewish life and Israel are really deeply bound up with each other. And I will say it goes in both directions. First thing I will say is it's a familial relationship. We're a family. And I think a lot of American Jews think of Israelis as definitely people with their own national identity, with their own culture and their own attitudes, but also as people who are our cousins, effectively. And the great majority of American Jews still support Israel and want the US government to support Israel. And as for the Israeli side, they know that they need the support of the United States, and the October 7th and the horrific terrorist attack on Israel, followed by the threats from Hezbollah in the north, and then the war that's followed, show that Israel still very much needs the United States regionally for its safety and protection. And I think most Israelis understand that the American Jewish community is crucial to, and I would go so far as to say indispensable, to sustaining US support of Israel. I don't think that American evangelical support of Israel is permanent enough to function in the same kind of way. So the first thing I would just say is, you know, this is a very close relationship. And then I'd go further and say, for a lot of American Jews, Israel is the most important part of their Jewishness. And you can, imagine this by just, imagining yourself in a progressive synagogue or temple. And the rabbi gets up on Yom Kippur to give a sermon and starts by saying, some days I don't believe in God. No one would bat an eyelash. No one would be shocked. No one would be horrified. And now imagine the same rabbi standing up and saying, some days I'm really convinced that Israel was a terrible mistake and should never have come into existence. I mean, in most, even progressive communities in the American Jewish world, that rabbi would have trouble keeping her job or his job. And that shows you the centrality of Israel. And so if Israel were to recede generationally in the minds of younger American Jews, that would really entail a rethinking of what it means to be a Jew. And so younger Jews would have to be looking to other things than Israel to sustain their Jewishness. It would have to be more the spiritual and familial aspects, and maybe some of the mystical aspects of contemporary Judaism.
And with all this closeness that so many American Jews feel with Israel, of course, the even greater affiliation is with the United States and the health of the country here. And so how do American Jews reconcile, when in so many cases they're thoroughly opposed to the Netanyahu government, how the war is being conducted, understanding a military response to the heinous assault on Israel by Hamas, but at the same time being critical in many ways of how that's being done. And yet the US government, of course, continues to support Israel, provide arms, intelligence, financial support to a great degree. How do American Jews work through the ultimate connection to the country they live in, they love, but also this connection with Israel and wanting it to survive even as they're critical of it in the moment?
I mean, you just described it very well, Larry, and the short answer is it's complicated. What I think most American Jews who would consider themselves liberal Zionists have tried to do is, in the initial days after October 7, applaud President Biden's really steadfast, nearly absolute support of Israel, understanding that it was just an accident of who the Israeli government was at the time when this terrible attack happened. And then first to encourage Israel on its own to define its war aims and try to get the hostages back in a way that might actually enable that to happen, without killing so many innocent people in Gaza that the world begins to wonder if the effort to get the hostages back is really what's going on anymore. And then over time, I think a lot of American Jews have come closer to the position that Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer took in a really dramatic speech and from the Senate floor, where he said, I think of myself as responsible in some way for Israel as an American Jew. And I want them to see that they're endangering themselves. And that, I think, gave a signal to President Biden to start making much tougher demands on the Israeli government to find its way to a ceasefire, one that would bring home hostages. And that's where we are now. And the conflict is happening in real time on the ground in Gaza. And the political conflict between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden is live. And, I don't want you to navigate away from our conversation here, but you can see the latest of it, on the news right now. And so, it's an ongoing, delicate conflict. I think for most American Jews today, the key is to distinguish Israel as a state from Bibi Netanyahu and his government and the things that he's doing right now. And I think that's the hard part.
I don't know if you had a chance to read Tom Friedman's column of yesterday. I believe it's the day it was in the paper, but it's on the Times website, in which he said that the Biden administration and Congress really needs to stop with the support of the Israeli government and under the current terms, and to demand that Israel reach a ceasefire immediately over Gaza, contingent on the return of all the Israeli hostages held by Hamas. And he takes a very, very strong stand that the U.S. government is really enabling Netanyahu and is fueling the potential demise of Israel, that's finding itself engaged in all these different potential war fronts and certainly conflict fronts right now. What were your thoughts about what he wrote?
Tom has always been, in my view, a very staunch friend of Israel. And so when he wrote immediately after October 7 that Israel shouldn't make the mistakes that we Americans made in Afghanistan and Iraq by enmeshing itself in a long, fruitless, expensive, and costly, in terms of human lives and money conflict, it was kind of remarkable that he said that, because as a political reality, he understood perfectly well, he's a sophisticated guy, that Israel was going to retaliate. They weren't not going to retaliate. What he's been trying to do, I think, in his columns, including this most recent one, is to indicate that Israeli national security interests are not being served by the war that Israel is currently fighting in Gaza. He's effectively trying to intervene in the Israeli political debate about what should be done, and saying that the United States government and American Jews who pressure the US government in an appropriate democratic way should take a stand on behalf of a rational policy that will make Israel safer. And that's the way he's been framing it. He hasn't been framing it primarily in humanitarian terms. He's been framing it primarily in real world, realistic terms. And, that's noteworthy. And he has, meaningful relationships in Israel, not so much in the current Israeli government, but among senior Israeli figures. And he has close readers in the US government and in the White House with whom he speaks. So I think that voice has been very clear, and we'll see how the administration reacts. The Biden administration has been trying to do both. They've been trying to show support of Israel without finding themselves in a position where everything that Israel might do in Gaza is laid at their feet. And that has been a very hard thing for them to pull off. And I think, what I can say with respect to the Biden folks, that they're doing the best job they can, but that they haven't done a great job of threading that needle. I'm not saying that anyone could have done, but I'm not sure that they have.
I want to go back to the generational divide and get into what you see as a professor on campus, because obviously faculty, like students, have been embroiled in the conflicts with the demonstrations and encampments on campus. But in my generation, and I'm older than you are, but when I was a teenager, many of my friends would go to Israel and they would work on kibbutzes, and this was something that was, they and their siblings would do. And the sense I got that the reason for it was to help them understand the importance of Israel as an American Jew, to get a sense of what life was like there, and to see it as the kind of safety valve that, heaven forbid there be attacks against Jews around the world, that they'd understand the importance of Israel. Well, I wonder with, generations today, if that sense of sort of the importance of Israel, investment in Israel, that's kind of been lost. And is any of this on the parents, so to speak?
I don't think it's the parents' fault, because I think the parents believe what we've always believed and are teaching our kids what we believe. But we're also teaching them something we maybe believe in even more fundamentally, which is that the core value of our tradition and faith is the value of social justice and of tikkun olam, of making the world a better place than you found it. And so then it becomes a practical debate about, we all agree, we and our kids all agree that social justice is the highest divine value that comes from the Jewish tradition. But what we're debating is, where is Israel as it actually exists on the scale of social justice? And that's where it does get tricky, because if you're a young person today, a smart one who follows the news, you see that Israel isn't completely independent of the United States. Maybe Israel is a safety valve for American Jews, but if tomorrow the United States stopped supporting Israel, then Israel would be in a very, very difficult situation, globally and regionally. Very difficult situation, especially with the possibility of a second front in a war against Hezbollah. And that's nothing to do with any failure of Zionism. That's just the way the world has evolved. The old idea from the 19th century that if we created our own little country, we would be able to defend ourselves against anybody. And if we had a nuclear weapon, we'd definitely be able to. That isn't actually the way the world has panned out. It turns out there are still superpowers, and you still need to be in relationship to those superpowers when the chips are down, especially if you live in a very rough neighborhood, which Israel assuredly does. And so I think for the young people, they're a little less convinced of the idea that Israel is the safety valve. And they're a little more upset about what most Israelis view as a price they're willing to pay to preserve their own safety. I think a lot of younger American Jews don't have as clear a sense of just how dangerous it is for Israel, and therefore don't have as clear a sense of why the harm that Israel does to civilians in the course of its war in Gaza is seen within Israel as very much as justified.
But much of the rhetoric I think we see, Professor, goes beyond just criticism of how Israel has carried out this war in Gaza and the tremendous loss of Palestinian life. That it goes into branding Israel as a colonizer, as engaging in South Africa like apartheid. It's a much more fundamental and, in fact, historic criticism of Israel than it is just the criticism we were talking about earlier that so many American Jews have of Israel and what it's doing right now under the Netanyahu government. And so I guess that's what I'm sort of trying to get at, is how did those notions become
Yes.
seemingly as prominent as they are, even among young American Jews?
So let me begin there by saying I believe that it's legitimate to criticize Israel, and I also believe that it's possible for criticism of Israel to morph into a genuine form of a word we haven't used yet, but anti-Semitism. And I wrote a piece for Time magazine. I was lucky they put it on the cover, called The New Anti-Semitism, that was talking exactly about what you're describing, Larry. The moments where the idea that Israel's government can be legitimately criticized shifts to the idea that Israel is somehow a white supremacist country, which is, I think, a really fundamentally mistaken way of understanding the analogy between race and the political and social and ethnic realities in the Middle East, or that Israel is a colonizing country, which is certainly not what the people who were settlers who moved to Israel in the first place, the pioneers who moved to Israel in the first place, thought they were doing. They did, on the other hand, know that at the time that Israel was being formed, Palestine was governed by the British Mandate, And Britain was an imperial power that administered all kinds of colonies of its own. And so the Zionists had to side with that imperial power to have any chance of getting a government. And they, of course, did that. And so I think what's happened is the fact that the early Zionists did ally themselves with Britain. I mean, they also were very angry at the British, but on the whole, they knew that the British were committed because of the Balfour Declaration, where they promised they would, to getting them a state. That I think that historical truth has kind of morphed into the idea that Israel is itself an imperial or colonial force, which is, again, it's just not so when you realize that more than half of Israel's population are Middle Eastern Jews. Its Jewish population are Middle Eastern Jews. And for the other Jews, their experience was not of going as colonists, but of fleeing Europe. And they needed to flee. And if they didn't flee, they died in the Holocaust. So, I mean, I think, just to add one last point, Larry, there is a kind of tendency of anti-Semitic rhetoric going back really more than 1,000 years, of taking whatever are the preoccupations of a society in a given time and projecting them onto the Jews. So if it was the 19th century and industrialism had grown and there was a struggle between capital on the one hand and labor on the other, Jews were depicted as both the ultimate capitalists and the ultimate communists. And that's a perfect example of anti-Semitism in action. Everyone was worried legitimately about the question of capital and labor, and then they projected the thing they didn't like onto Jews. Our society today is rightly concerned about racism and white supremacy, and that's getting projected onto Israel. Our society is rightly concerned about colonialism or imperialism, or the taking of land like the land of the United States from the first peoples who lived here. And that's an appropriate preoccupation for us societally. And at the margin, that's being projected onto Israel. And in that sense, that's where there's a continuity between classical anti-Semitism and these ideas about Israel.
You were just mentioning contradictory Jewish stereotypes, which you've got a lot of that in the book as well, toward the latter part of the book. I found that so interesting, and the way that you highlighted that. We don't have time to get into that in this program, but just fascinating how you pointed out many of those. We have a listener, Susan, who asks, what do you make of Netanyahu accepting the Republican leadership of the House's offer to speak to Congress?
You know, Netanyahu, it's not the first time that this has happened. He's addressed a joint session of Congress before without the acquiescence of the executive branch in the United States. And of course, Congress doesn't need the executive to get there. So from his perspective, it's a political win domestically in Israel. I think probably everyone on this Zoom knows that he's barely clinging to power. And that's a way for him to say to his domestic audience, look at me. I'm one of the rare foreign, leaders who can go and be invited to address Congress. So there's prestige in that for him. And it reinforces his narrative that Israel needs him to operate as a global leader. As for its consequences domestically in the US, he seems genuinely not to care. And that's the part that seems to me to be very, very short-sighted. And I'll just give you a concrete example. I mean, the real danger to Israel right now, in my view, is that, and it's not going to happen overnight, but it's a real danger now, that support for Israel could become a partisan issue in the United States. The basic reason that Israel has been able to rely on US support, no matter who's president, no matter who controls Congress, is that support for Israel has been a bipartisan issue. But think of Ukraine. Ukraine is in a genuinely existential struggle for its existence. And if Donald Trump is elected president, Ukraine will lose that existential struggle. It's a painful thing to say, but it is the truth. And that's because support for Ukraine and its war against Russia has become a partisan issue in the United States. It didn't start that way, but it's become that. That's the last thing that Israel wants. And that's the last thing that American Jewish supporters of Israel would want. And the more that Benjamin Netanyahu participates in what looks like a domestic American political move, the more he plays into this idea that Trump is out there repeating again and again, which is that American Jews who support Israel should vote for him and should become Republicans. And that would be a disaster from Israel's perspective.
Judge Joe asks, do you believe that Israel's policies in the West Bank smack of colonialism? If not, how do you distinguish between them?
Israel's policies in the West Bank started after 1967 under conditions of what Israel itself called legally and still calls occupation under international law. And when that was seen to be a short-term undertaking, Israel was following the rules that international law lays down for what you do if you conquer territory and you're not going to annex it. You use the legal system that existed previously. You don't have to give people democratic rights because they're not citizens of your country. That, I think, was defensible as long as peace was a viable option. And I'm old enough to remember very, very clearly the handshake on the White House lawn between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin with Bill Clinton behind them in the early 90s. And it seemed at that time, now 30 years ago, that we were on a potential path towards peace. And that would have, as it were, cleansed the Israeli occupation of the West Bank of this undemocratic structure that it has, and indeed oppressive structure. That broke down and was followed by the second intifada, the intifada of bombs and the suicide bombings in Israel by Palestinians that led to the erection of the wall. And since then, something has changed. What's happened is that fewer and fewer people in Israel actually want there to be a two-state solution. And fewer people in Palestine believe that it's possible to have such a thing. And that's what makes the current situation look like a situation, perhaps not of colonialism precisely, although there are Jewish settlements, and those settlements in that sense look like colonial settlements, but look not like the paradigm of any system that could be fair or just. And that is clearly the state of play that exists now. Now, what's the way out of it? I try to look to the future. The way out of it, there's only one way out of it that I can see, and that way remains a genuine two-state solution. Let's not forget that Saudi Arabia wants that two-state solution. It wants it badly. And it was pressuring Israel in that direction before October 7, and it's returned to doing so. And what Saudi Arabia is promising is not nothing. They're promising complete normalization of relations with Israel, which would mean that the most important and powerful and rich Arab country would be fully normalized in its relations with Israel, which means the rest of the Arab world would follow, the countries that haven't already done so. That's a pretty good carrot. In fact, there's never going to be a better carrot. And I think if Israel turns that down, I think it runs the real risk of looking like it has decided once and for all that it has no interest in ever giving Palestinians in the West Bank the opportunity to have basic rights in their own state. And that, I think, would move us in the direction that the questioner is asking. I really think it would. So I'm not there yet, but if Israel definitively rejects the possibility for peace now, then I'm going to start to move in the direction of what the questioner is saying.
Well, here's the irony. You were talking a few minutes ago about how policy toward Israel is becoming a partisan issue in the U.S. and that really makes you fearful. Conversely, in Israel, we see much more across the spectrum, even among liberal Israelis, this skepticism about a two-state solution. I haven't seen the actual polling on that, but that's certainly the sense that I get of what's happening there. And if everybody's lost hope in the region, Israelis and Palestinians, and no one believes that they can live alongside each other, that's a pretty dire future that's going to yield.
It is. And look, to be clear, after October 7, you can understand why many, many Israelis think the Palestinians will never agree to peace with us. Of course, in reality, the conditions in Gaza were horrific before October 7, but that doesn't excuse the intentional killing of 1,200 civilians or the sexual violence or the taking of hostages. And so it's not so surprising that many Israelis feel that way, and not surprising that Palestinians don't think the Israelis are serious about peace either. So where does that leave us? As you say, on one side, a very dark picture where there's no real way out. On the other hand, there still does exist a possibility. I'm not saying it's the most likely possibility, but a possibility supported by the most powerful regional power other than Israel, namely Saudi Arabia, strongly supported by the government of the United States, supported by the Biden administration, and I will add, supported back in the day by the Trump administration when they were negotiating the Abraham Accords, that would essentially push the Israelis and the Palestinians into a settlement, even if they are kicking and screaming along the way. And to my mind, the only way we're ever going to get a settlement at this point is if both sides are pushed into it, kicking and screaming. And that's not ideal. It's not optimal. But to my mind, it is really the only option other than the very bleak future that you point to, Larry.
We have some terrific viewer questions. I want to get to as many as we can. Will asks, what do you say to those who are identifying Jews and Zionists who are so discontented with Netanyahu and so hate the way the war is being prosecuted that they themselves are withdrawing from their Jewish identity and from their steadfast support of Zionism?
I mean, that's a really painful, almost tragic consequence of what's happening here. And I know people who fit that description, people who are proudly Jewish and proudly supporting Israel, who can't, in good conscience, be all right with what's happening, even though they feel very deeply the agony of October 7 and the pain of the hostages and their families. What I would say is sort of a two-part thing. When your family members are doing something that you think is profoundly wrong, it's appropriate to tell them so. It's appropriate to push back. It's appropriate to feel ashamed. Those things are appropriate feelings if it's your family member. It's also appropriate to remember that they're still your family members and that you want to do everything you can to help bring them to a better place and a better way of being. And I completely understand if people begin to pull back from their sense of identification with Israel when Israel is doing things that they can't live with. I also really I think it's really tragic if then people think, I want to withdraw from my Jewishness. And I see this more with the younger generation. And this also really frightens me, Larry. I'm concerned that a younger generation of Jews, if they believe that the only way to be Jewish is to be fully in support of Israel, and if that entails supporting all of Israel's policies, even when they can't in good conscience live with them, that will lead them to the conclusion that they should walk away from being Jewish at all. And that's not true, because there are very rich resources in Jewishness that include protest and include social disagreement and also include an apolitical stance that says we're going to do this Jewish thing that we do as a family and with our own traditions and our own practices and maybe even our own faith. And it's going to give us meaning within our world without committing ourselves entirely to the political movement of Zionism. And I'm not advocating that as a first option. What I'm saying is I don't want to see a situation where we lose a generation of Jews because those Jews think that Jewishness and Zionism are identical and that Zionism requires you to be on board with Bibi Netanyahu.
I raised this issue, and I know it's a bit fraught, but as someone who isn't Jewish, I think a lot about what would this country be without a particular group, whether it's an immigrant group, and I think about what would America be without Jewish Americans, and I mean, it's staggering what the loss would be when you think of all the contributions in so many areas to the betterment of so many people, particularly people who have struggled the most in this country, but everybody. And sometimes it feels like we don't really connect that with Jewish identity. We don't really celebrate it. I mean, people will talk about, oh, my son or my brother, they're doing this really great thing and they're making a contribution. The world's great. But it seems I don't hear that so much connected with Jewish identity and values and sense of what it means to be a Jew in America, that there is all this incredible contribution from the justice system that you're an expert in to so many different things. And I wonder, I mean, is there a place for that in Jewish identity? And I know that can take us into fraught territory of stereotypes and demonizing. You can turn the tremendous thing into something nefarious, but is there a place for that?
There is, and the place for it, the affirmative place for it, is people saying that they are Jews united for democracy and justice, I mean, it's identifying the Jewish thing you do as meaningfully connected to values. I don't think that you need to say that, Curb Your Enthusiasm is a fundamental pillar of American Jewish identity, though as a cultural matter, it is, because it's not necessarily connected to the spiritual dimension of being
Yeah.
Jewish, but it's meaningful.
Cultural. Yeah.
It's meaningful culturally and powerful culturally, and it's fine to identify that too. But as you say, American Jews are understandably a little nervous about drawing attention to facts like that. I mean, as you were just mentioning that, I was thinking in my mind, what's an example that I can think of from my own life? And I saw that on the lineup of events that America at Crossroads is going to have soon, there's going to be one about the Trump legal process. And I was thinking back to when I testified against Trump at the first impeachment hearing, and I was there with 3 other law professors, and there were 4 of us total. And as it happens, the 3 of us who testified that Trump should be impeached happened all to have been Jewish. Would have been totally inappropriate. I don't think I even thought of that till this moment when you asked me that question.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Would have been pretty inappropriate for anyone to draw attention to that. Inappropriate for us to draw attention to it, and definitely inappropriate if someone on the other side had drawn attention to it, and I would have been very concerned by it. In fact, if you ask me, why do I think that anti-Semitism in America, though it is real, doesn't begin to approach what it is even today in Europe, and not even close to what it was historically, it's because events like that could happen with nobody really taking account of that. I mean, I think there are other examples of this that I think are worthy of taking note of too, that show you that things aren't as bad in the United States as they could, certainly as they could be or as they've been at other times. So I think that the affirmative story here is Jews can and should be proud of why they are Jewish when they have a reason for it. And that reason has to be commitment to their values, and those values include social justice and family, and also a little irony and some humor, and trying to contribute to the nation as a whole. And if I could just be shamelessly patriotic for a minute, my own patriotism as an American is fundamentally derivative of the fact that had my ancestors not been able to come to the United States, between 1900 and 1920, they would have died. It's not a maybe situation. It was come here and look at my amazingly fortunate life and that of my kids, or die. And for me, that means that I'm always going to be an America first, an America last person. And I don't think I'm alone in that. I think a lot of American Jews feel that way too.
Maury says, given the generational trend of American Jews becoming less and less interested in Israel and in religious practice, what do you think will happen to the number of American Jews who will carry on with meaningful Jewish identity, and who will be the torchbearers in the U.S. for Israel in the future?
A couple of answers to that. The first is there's a famous line, and it's true, that the only thing every generation of Jews has in common with every previous generation is the complete confidence that it will be the last. And so the worry that the Jews are going to disappear has always been with us, and we can rest assured that that is not going to happen. And the reason for that is that the resources that Judaism has to offer are rich and deep enough to meet the needs of the moment. So just to give a concrete example, from 1850 to 1950, modern Jews who wanted to be progressive people and live in the modern world, they didn't want a Judaism that had what they thought of as mumbo jumbo in it. So they looked back to the rationalist tradition in Judaism, and they came up with a Judaism that is based in philosophy and natural science, and didn't have angels particularly, and didn't have magic particularly, and didn't have practices in the synagogue that they might have thought of as awkward or embarrassing. Well, you know what? The young people of, the 2020s, across every religion and religious denomination, they want the angels. They want the magic. They want spirituality, and they're flocking to forms of spirituality that provide these things. It turns out that Judaism has all those things too, I mean, the angels that people are talking about, those come from the Bible in the first place. They are rich in the Jewish tradition. They've never gone away from the Jewish tradition. Ditto for mysticism, ditto for magic. And so I think Judaism will rise to that challenge because it has the materials there. I will also add that Orthodox Judaism, traditionalist Judaism, and Orthodox evolutionist Judaism are very strong and growing in the United States, and they will continue to grow. And they're growing in Israel too. That community has a more right-wing cast, right-wing on Israel politics, right-wing on US politics. And so that will shift, that demographic shift in numbers will shift the public posture of American Jews. Today, it's still true that more than 70% of American Jews are Democrats. That is not going to be true in 50 years.
want to get a couple more questions in before we have to close. But I was just thinking about maybe 20 years ago, what I was hearing the greatest concern was about intermarriage. And so would that mean that just people would stop practicing or wouldn't raise their children as Jewish? And of course, we see so many of those families that are interfaith marriages, the kids are raised as Jewish, and their Jewish identity is an important part of family life. Janice asked, do you believe Israel will remain a democracy? Do you believe a more theocratic or autocratic form of government could still be consistent with a Jewish state?
So this is a painful thing to say, especially to an audience which thinks of Jewishness as connected to democracy. But that's only one form of Jewishness. There are also non-democratic forms of Jewishness. So you could have a Jewish state that was authentically Jewish in certain respects that was non-democratic. I wouldn't want that to be the case. I don't want that to be true. I want a Jewishness that stands for democracy. But you could have such a thing, and Israel could become something like that. It's not around the corner, because Israelis still strongly believe in democratic principles and values, at least for citizens of Israel. But Israel has been on the knife's edge with respect to its democratic character, and that was before October 7. You know, as listeners will, as viewers will know, over the 9 months before October 7, there's a big internal dispute in Israel about the falling apart of democracy. So that's an ongoing story. It's put on hold by October 7, but it will be back. And the answer to that question is that the jury is very much still out.
Lauren asks, how do you, Noah, personally feel if you were the prime minister of Israel? How would you deal with the dilemma presented by Hamas and Sinwar, who's willing to fight until the last drop of other Gazan blood?
I would prioritize, I mean, let me be clear, that's not my job. And I want to be respectful and empathetic to the people who actually have to do these jobs and make these heartbreaking decisions. But I would strongly prioritize the return of the hostages at this point, because it seems clear to me that if after this many months of fighting, Hamas hasn't been completely destroyed, it is not going to be destroyed. And, you know, my first government experience was working as a constitutional advisor for the US government in Iraq. And I had a front row seat as a very young person to how the greatest ambitions of our capacities as a military were thwarted, despite our tremendous overwhelming advantage, by the fact that you cannot force people to adopt some set of views that you want them to hold. And so I would not continue fighting in a way that does not seem to be degrading support for Hamas at all within Gaza. I would do a deal that assured the return of any hostages who are still alive, and of course the remains of those who are not. And I would prioritize that.
Jonathan says most progressive American Jews have always supported a two-state solution, but now I'm rethinking this, he says. How does two states work without a long-term re-education of Palestinians, both in Gaza and the West Bank, where the educational system has been based on Jew hatred and murder of Jews?
Well, the bottom line is, it's exactly what the questioner said. You need substantial re-education. And that has to be supervised and administered internationally. And that's part of the process I was describing, where any two-state solution is going to have to be imposed on the two sides, to some extent, kicking and screaming. But those kinds of re-education efforts they can happen. They have occurred elsewhere in the world. Look at Germany after World War II, where under the auspices of first an American occupation, but then a regime backed by the United States, young Germans were taught to give up on their anti-Semitic beliefs and to take moral responsibility for what came before. So it's not unprecedented for re-education to change cultural values. And that was Germany.
We have just about a minute tops for you to give a closing statement, and that can be whatever you want, but I didn't get a chance to ask you just why you think it's so important for American Jews to examine their faith, if they do have faith in God or not, but to examine that as foundational to their other views about the world and their sense of who they are as a Jew in the world.
Thank you for that, Larry, and thank you for all your great questions. The reason I wrote the book, and you allude to this, was that my kids are going off to college, and I wanted to have an answer for them, or a set of answers to the question, why bother? You know, why bother to be Jewish? You don't have to be. You could walk away from it. And to me, the reason to organize your life around something as big and complicated and rich as being Jewish, even if it's only part of your life, it can't just be that it fell into your lap. It has to be that it's meaningful to you, that it makes meaning for you in your life. And to me, that meaning is made by embracing other Jews and the rest of the world in love and acknowledging that that love entails genuine struggle. It's not easy. Being Jewish is not, it's not all fun and games, as I think every Jew in the world has always known, but especially since October 7. But the upside, the benefit, is having that sense of being collectively engaged with other humans in a loving struggle with each other and with the nature of the universe to do the best that we can. And to me, that really is and can be worthwhile.
Professor, thank you so much. It's been great talking with you this evening. Thank you for your thoughtful answers to our viewers' questions, and thank you so much for the wide-ranging conversation. We really appreciate it. And again, the book is To Be a Jew Today, A New Guide to God, Israel, and the Jewish People by Harvard University Law professor Noah Feldman. Please support these programs with your tax-deductible contributions. Every week, we have these remarkable conversations with so many great guests who really leave us with things to think about for days into the future. You can go to the website, JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. That's JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. Your gifts make a tremendous difference in any amount in supporting these programs. Now, next Wednesday, it's former U.S. Attorney and MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissman. He'll talk about the indictments and trials of former President Trump. That's next Wednesday, June 26th, 5 p.m. Pacific, as always. From all of us in America to Crossroads, have a very good night.